Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I used a Ouija board alone to contact my grandfather. Now I'm hearing his voice in my head. I don't know if I should be posting this. Actually, I'm pretty sure I shouldn't. But honestly, I'm terrified, and I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind. So here it is. I used a Ouija board, alone, and now I think my dead grandfather is talking to me, except it doesn't sound like him anymore. Let me back up a bit. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to paranormal stuff. Ghosts, spirits, demons, none of it ever felt real to me. But a couple of weeks ago, my world flipped upside down. My grandfather passed away. He was the kind of guy who lit up every room he walked into, always cracking jokes, always making people feel like they mattered. Losing him left this massive, gaping hole in my chest. I guess grief makes you do crazy things. It started late one night when I was alone in my apartment. I'd been scrolling through videos online, deep dives into the paranormal, conspiracy theories, all that weird late-night rabbit hole stuff you only watch when you're too tired to think straight. Somewhere in the mix, I saw a clip of someone using a Ouija board. The comments were full of warnings. Never use it alone. Don't take it lightly. You're opening a door you can't close. I should have stopped there. I really should have. But the idea wouldn't let me go. I kept thinking, what if I could talk to Grandpa? What if he's out there and he's waiting for me to reach out? It felt stupid and desperate. But at 2 a.m, when the world is quiet and your thoughts get loud, desperation makes sense. I ordered a Ouija board from some sketchy website. It arrived a few days later, wrapped in flimsy packaging that smelled faintly of mildew. Honestly, it looked like a cheap party prop. Nothing ominous about it. But as soon as I held it, this weird heaviness settled in my chest, like I'd just made a decision I couldn't take back. Last Friday, I finally worked up the courage to use it. I turned off all the lights, lit a single candle, and sat cross-legged on my living room floor. It felt ridiculous at first, but as soon as I placed my fingers on the planchette, my heart started pounding like crazy. "Grandpa?" I whispered. My voice sounded so small in the empty room. "Are you there?" Nothing happened. The planchette didn't budge. The candle flickered, but that was probably just a draft. I felt stupid for even trying. But then, after a few minutes, the planchette started to move. At first I thought I'd done it without realizing, but the movement was smooth, deliberate. It slid to yes. I froze. "Grandpa?" I asked again, my voice shaking. "Is it really you?" "Yes." My hands were trembling so much I had to fight to keep them on the board. "If it's you, what was the name of the dog you had when you were a kid?" The planchette paused for a second, then spelled out Max. I swear my blood turned to ice. That was right. My mum used to tell stories about Max, this scrappy little mutt Grandpa had found on the side of the road when he was 10. There's no way I could have moved the planchette on my own. I didn't even remember the dog's name until I saw it spelled out. I should have stopped there. I should have thanked him for answering and said goodbye. But I didn't. I had so many questions. "Are you okay?" I asked. The planchette spelled out no. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Why not?" I whispered. "What's wrong?" This time, it didn't spell anything. The planchette just started spinning in small circles, faster and faster, until I pulled my hands away. The candle flickered wildly, and for a split second, I thought I heard something, like a low, guttural whisper. But it didn't sound like Grandpa. It sounded angry. I blew out the candle and shoved the board back into its box, heart hammering in my chest. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that my brain had somehow filled in the blanks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of someone calling my name. "Eli." It was faint, barely above a whisper, but it was coming from inside my room. I shot up, heart racing, and looked around. Nothing. My apartment was empty, but the voice sounded familiar. It sounded like Grandpa. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just hearing things. Grief does weird stuff to your mind, right? That's what I kept telling myself. Until it happened again. And again. By the third night, the voice wasn't just whispering my name. It was saying other things too. Stuff only Grandpa would have known. Remember the fishing trip when you caught that boot instead of a fish? You cried for hours. It was his voice, but something about it was off. It was too sharp, too cold, like someone was imitating him. And then, last night, it said something that made my blood run cold. Why'd you leave me there, Eli? You shouldn't have stopped talking to me. I haven't touched the Ouija board since that first night. It's still in the box, shoved under my bed. But I can't shake the feeling that I opened some kind of door. And whatever came through, it's not my grandfather. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear his voice. It wasn't constant. It would come in bursts, just enough to jolt me awake, heart pounding. The worst part, it wasn't just in my head anymore. It felt like it was coming from the walls, or maybe the air itself, like the whole room was whispering back at me. And it wasn't always clear words. Sometimes it was just murmurs, unintelligible but definitely there. By the next morning, I was running on fumes. My coffee tasted like ash. My apartment felt smaller, darker, like the shadows were stretching out farther than they should. I couldn't bring myself to stay inside, so I grabbed my jacket and left, hoping a walk would clear my head. It didn't. I'd only made it a couple of blocks when I saw him, or at least I thought I did. An older man with a grey cap and a familiar hunch was sitting on a bench at the park near my apartment. My chest tightened. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But I swear, for a split second, it looked exactly like him. "Grandpa," I whispered, stopping dead in my tracks. The man turned, and my heart dropped. His face was wrong, too smooth, too pale, like a wax figure that had started to melt. And his eyes, they were empty, just black pits staring straight through me. He didn't say anything. He just smiled. This slow, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. I blinked, and he was gone. The bench was empty. I practically ran back to my apartment, locking the door behind me and double-checking all the windows. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't catch my breath. I kept telling myself I was just sleep-deprived, that grief was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something had changed. That night, the voice came back. Louder this time. I was brushing my teeth, staring blankly at my reflection when I heard it behind me. Eli. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth. It was the same voice, but it sounded rougher now, almost guttural, like it had been dragged through gravel. Slowly, I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs. No one was there, but then I noticed something in the mirror. My reflection. It wasn't moving. I dropped the toothbrush, my breath catching in my throat. My reflection just stood there, staring back at me with a blank expression. Its lips twisted into a smirk, one I definitely wasn't making. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the bathroom mat, and the moment I broke eye contact, the reflection moved. It tilted its head, the smirk widening into something that barely resembled a human expression. I slammed the bathroom door shut and sat against it, trying to steady my breathing. My brain was racing, trying to come up with any explanation that didn't involve the supernatural. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was hallucinating. But deep down, I knew none of that made sense. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, the bathroom door still closed, every light in the apartment turned on. The next few days blurred together. I stopped sleeping altogether, too scared of what might happen if I closed my eyes. I started hearing his voice everywhere, on the street, in the grocery store, even at work. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, this low murmur just at the edge of my hearing. You shouldn't have left me. Come back. Open the door again. At first, I thought it was just some weird auditory hallucination, but then other things started happening. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. Small things at first, keys, pens, my phone. I'd set them down in one place and find them in another. But then it escalated. One night, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. My heart leapt into my throat as I stumbled into the kitchen, half expecting to find someone or something waiting for me. Instead, I found all my cabinet doors wide open, the glasses and plates smashed on the floor. I didn't even hear them fall. It was like they just exploded. By this point, I was desperate. I started Googling anything and everything about Ouija boards, how to close them, how to undo whatever I'd done. The more I read, the worse I felt. Apparently, using the board alone was one of the worst things you could do. You're more likely to attract something malicious, one site warned. Great, fantastic. Just what I needed to hear. There was one piece of advice that came up over and over. Say goodbye. That seemed easy enough. I grabbed the board from under my bed, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to touch it. I set it down on the coffee table, lit a candle, and placed my fingers on the planchette. Who am I speaking to? I asked, my voice shaking. The planchette moved immediately, almost violently, spelling out, "Not him." My blood ran cold. "What do you want?" I whispered. "You!" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my hands steady. "I'm done," I said. "This is over. Goodbye." The planchette didn't move. The candle flickered, and for a moment, I thought it had worked. But then the planchette jerked to the center of the board, spinning so fast I had to let go. The flame shot up, nearly catching the edge of the board on fire, and I swear I heard laughter, low, guttural and echoing from somewhere deep inside the apartment. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I'll ever sleep again. I didn't go back to work. I called in sick, though the guy on the phone sounded like he didn't believe me. Not that it mattered. I couldn't focus on anything anymore. I couldn't even think straight. Every second I was in that apartment, I felt like I was being watched, like something was just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The voice wasn't just in my head now, it was in everything. The pipes groaned in a low rumble that almost sounded like words. The hum of the fridge seemed to shift pitch, forming whispers that I couldn't quite make out. Even the floorboards creaked in patterns that felt deliberate, like footsteps pacing just outside my field of vision. And then there were the knocks. They started faint, almost polite. A light tapping on the walls, always just after midnight. At first I thought it was the neighbours, but the sound wasn't coming from their side. It was coming from inside my walls. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head and praying it would stop. But each night it got louder, more insistent. On the third night it wasn't knocking anymore, it was pounding. I didn't know what else to do, so I called my mum. I couldn't tell her everything. What was I supposed to say? "Hey Mum, I messed with a Ouija board, and now I think I'm being haunted." She would have laughed me off the phone. So I kept it vague, telling her I'd been feeling off ever since Grandpa passed. She hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "You know, there was something he always used to say when we were kids," she said. "Whenever we'd get scared, he'd tell us to stay out of the dark. Said the dark is where things hide." I felt a chill run down my spine. Grandpa used to say that to me too. I always thought it was just one of those harmless, old-timey warnings like, don't swim after eating or don't go out without a coat. But now, it felt like something more. "Why'd he say that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My mum was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she said finally. "He never explained, just said it was important." I wanted to press her, but something about her tone stopped me. She sounded scared. Like she knew more than she was letting on. That night, I didn't turn off the lights. Every lamp, every overhead bulb, every string of Christmas lights I'd forgotten to take down, they all stayed on. I even plugged in an old desk lamp I found in the back of my closet. The apartment was blindingly bright, but I didn't care. I wasn't taking any chances. Around 2 a.m, I was sitting on the couch trying to keep myself awake with bad TV when I heard it. A low, rasping whisper coming from the hallway. "Eli, the light won't save you." My stomach dropped. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway, but I couldn't see anything. The light from the living room didn't quite reach all the way down the hall, leaving a sliver of darkness just outside the bathroom door. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. I wanted to move, to grab my phone, to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. My muscles were locked, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Then I saw it. A hand, thin, bony, with fingers too long to be human, reached out from the shadows, wrapping around the edge of the bathroom doorframe. Slowly, it pulled itself into view. It wasn't my grandfather. The thing was tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, and its skin was stretched so tight over its skull that I could see every bone. Its eyes, God, its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. And its mouth, it was too wide, filled with rows of sharp, uneven teeth that glistened as it grinned at me. "Why did you call me?" it rasped, its voice echoing in my head like a bad dream. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. I just sat there, frozen, as it took a step closer, and then another. With each step, the shadows seemed to stretch, creeping toward me like living things. "You wanted to talk," it said, its grin widening. "So talk." Finally, I found my voice. It came out in a shaky whisper. "You're not him." The thing tilted its head like it was amused. "Does it matter?" it said. "You opened the door. You let me in. And now," its grin twisted into something cruel, almost gleeful. "Now you're mine." I don't remember what happened after that. 1 second, it was there, looming over me, and the next, I was waking up on the floor, the morning sun streaming through the windows. My body ached like I'd been hit by a truck and my head was pounding. The apartment was silent, too silent. All the lights were off, even the ones I'd left on. The bulbs were shattered, little shards of glass littering the floor. My TV was static, the screen cracked down the middle, and the Ouija board was sitting in the middle of the coffee table, the planchette resting on the word goodbye. I didn't touch the board, not even to move it. I just stared at it, the word goodbye feeling like some cruel joke. I hadn't said goodbye, I'd tried, but whatever was on the other side hadn't let me, and now it was here. I grabbed my phone and Googled how to get rid of a spirit. Most of the advice was the same as before: sage, salt, prayers. One forum suggested burning the Ouija board, but another warned that could make things worse. I was stuck. Every answer contradicted the next, and none of them felt like they'd work against this. The thing wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't my grandfather. It was something else, something bigger, something darker. That night, I tried the sage. It wasn't hard to find. There was a shop a few blocks away that sold all kinds of spiritual stuff. The lady behind the counter even gave me a little crash course on how to cleanse my space, though she kept asking questions I didn't want to answer. Like, did you summon something intentionally? And, are you sure it's a spirit? By the time I got home, the sun was already setting. The shadows stretched long and thin across the walls, and the air felt colder than usual, like the heat wasn't working. I lit the sage, muttering a half-hearted prayer as I walked through each room, waving the smoke into the corners like I'd been told. For a moment, it felt like it was working. The apartment seemed lighter, less suffocating. I could breathe again. And then the lights went out. The entire apartment plunged into darkness, and I froze. My first thought was a power outage, but when I looked out the window, the streetlights were still on. The building across the street was still lit up. It was just my apartment. My hand tightened around the bundle of sage, the smoke curling up into the blackness like it was being swallowed. My phone was in the other room, plugged into the charger by my bed. I didn't want to move, didn't want to leave the one spot where I felt even slightly safe, but I couldn't just stand there. I took a step forward, then another, feeling my way through the dark. My fingers brushed against the edge of the coffee table, then the back of the couch. I was halfway to the bedroom when I heard it, a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't coming from one direction, it was everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. It echoed through the apartment, growing louder with every second until it felt like my skull was vibrating. "You think you can get rid of me?" the voice rasped, its tone dripping with mockery. I didn't answer. My legs were shaking so hard I could barely stand, but I forced myself to keep moving. I reached the bedroom, fumbling for my phone in the dark. My fingers closed around it, and I pressed the power button, the screen casting a faint glow over the room. That's when I saw it. Standing in the corner, just barely illuminated by the phone's light, was the thing. It was taller than I remembered, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its hollow eyes seemed to absorb the glow, making the room feel even darker. "You called me," it hissed, taking a step closer. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "You can't send me away. Not now, not ever." I backed up until I hit the wall, clutching the phone like it was some kind of shield. "What do you want?" I choked out. The thing tilted its head, that awful grin spreading across its face. "I already told you," it said. "You." I don't remember what happened next. The phone slipped from my hands, the screen shattering against the floor. The thing lunged and I felt this overwhelming pressure like I was being crushed from the inside out. My vision blurred, my ears ringing with the sound of its laughter. When I came to, it was morning. The power was back on, the lights flickering weakly overhead. My phone was still on the floor, the screen cracked but still functional. And the Ouija board, it was gone. I searched the entire apartment, under the bed, in the closet, even the trash. It was nowhere. That day I called my mum again. I didn't care if she thought I was crazy. I needed answers. She picked up on the third ring, her voice heavy with sleep. "Eli, what's wrong? Did he ever talk about something following him?" I asked, my words tumbling out in a rush. There was a long pause on the other end. "Why would you ask that?" she said, finally, her tone wary. I told her everything. The board, the voice, the thing in my apartment. I left out the worst details. I didn't want her to panic, but I could hear the fear in her voice anyway. "Eli," she said quietly, "I don't know what you've done, but you need to leave. Get out of that apartment, right now." "What? Why?" "Just trust me," she said, her voice cracking. "Grandpa used to say the dark couldn't touch you if you kept moving. But if you stayed too long, it would find you. It would take you." I didn't understand what she meant, but the urgency in her voice sent a chill down my spine. I told her I'd pack my things and go. But as soon as I hung up, I realized something. The door to my apartment was open. The door shouldn't have been open. I locked it. I was sure of it. My hand was trembling as I approached, the gap between the door and the frame spilling shadows into the hallway. It wasn't just open. It was swinging gently, like someone had been standing there a second ago and stepped away. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The air felt colder near the door, almost icy, and the hallway beyond was darker than it should have been. The lights in the building weren't out, This darkness was different, thicker. It seemed to pulse, like it was alive. I took a step back, my mind racing. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The voice came again, soft and teasing, like it was right next to my ear. "You can't leave." The door slammed shut. I bolted, heading for the bedroom, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I didn't know where I was going. There was nowhere safe in the apartment, but I couldn't stay in the living room. The shadows there felt like they were moving, closing in around me. When I reached the bedroom, I locked the door behind me and slid the dresser in front of it for good measure. My breathing was ragged, my chest tight. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it, and started dialing my mum's number. Before I could hit call, the screen flickered. The signal bars disappeared. The phone shut off, the screen going completely black. "Eli!" The voice came again, louder this time, reverberating through the walls. "Why are you hiding?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just backed into the corner of the room, clutching the useless phone like it would somehow protect me. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights above me flickered, then dimmed, leaving me in a faint, eerie glow. The shadows in the corner began to shift. At first, it was subtle, just a dark patch that seemed to grow darker. Then, they started to take shape, long, thin limbs unfolding like a grotesque spider. And then I saw it. The thing crawled out of the corner, its hollow eyes locked on mine, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "You brought me here," it hissed, its voice layered with 100 whispers. "You opened the door. You let me in." "I didn't mean to," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't know." "Lies," it interrupted, its voice cutting through me like a blade. "You wanted this. You called to me." I shook my head, pressing myself tighter against the wall. "I didn't know it wasn't him," I whispered. "I thought I was talking to my grandfather." The thing laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my stomach turn. "Your grandfather isn't here," it said. "He never was. I've been waiting, Eli, watching, and now you're mine." I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let this thing take me. If it wanted me, it was going to have to fight for it. I lunged for the bedside table, grabbing the small bottle of salt I'd brought along with the sage. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I ripped off the cap and threw the contents at the thing as hard as I could. The reaction was instant. The salt hit its skin and it shrieked, the sound so piercing it felt like my eardrums would burst. The shadows recoiled, pulling back into the corner like a tide retreating. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then it laughed. The thing stepped forward, its movements slower, more deliberate. The spots where the salt had hit it smoked, tiny tendrils of vapor rising from its skin, but it didn't seem hurt. If anything, it seemed amused. "Do you think that will save you?" it rasped. "This is my domain now." The lights flickered again, and the air grew so heavy I felt like I was being crushed. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The thing loomed over me, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You can't fight me," it said. "You opened the door, and now..." It leaned down, its face inches from mine, its breath cold and rancid. "Now you'll never leave." I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, I remembered something my mum had said. "Stay out of the dark. The dark is where things hide." My eyes darted to the bedside lamp, the only light still on. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely move, but I reached up and grabbed it, yanking it free from the wall. The thing hesitated, its grin faltering for the first time. I held the lamp up like a weapon, aiming the bulb directly at its face. "You're not taking me," I whispered. And then I smashed the lamp on the floor, the bulb exploding in a brilliant flash of light. The thing screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the apartment. The shadows writhed and twisted, pulling away from the light. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. The shadows were gone. The air was warm again. But I didn't feel safe. Not yet. I grabbed what I could carry, my phone, my wallet, a jacket, and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing under the glow of a street lamp, the cold night air biting at my skin. The apartment building loomed behind me, its windows dark and lifeless. I didn't look back. I haven't gone back since. I've been staying with a friend, though I haven't told them the full story. I don't think they'd believe me if I did. The voice hasn't come back, but sometimes late at night I still feel it, watching, waiting. I'll never touch a Ouija board again. We asked the Ouija board about my friend's strange illness. It gave us a cure. We were too afraid to try. All right, so this all started about 2 months ago when my best friend, Nick, got sick. Not like a flu or COVID kind of sick, but weird sick. It came out of nowhere. One day we were gaming and scarfing down pizza, and the next, he was barely able to stay awake. He looked pale, like he'd aged 10 years overnight. No appetite, no energy, and no answers from the doctors. They ran tests, blood work, MREs, the whole deal. Nothing. It wasn't cancer, wasn't a virus, wasn't anything they could pin down. They called it idiopathic fatigue syndrome. That's just a fancy way of saying, we have no freaking clue what's wrong with you. It was terrifying to watch because Nick's the kind of guy who can chug a monster and run a 5K for fun. To see him like that, barely able to lift his head off the couch, hit me harder than I thought it would. At first, I tried to keep things light, cracking jokes, bringing over snacks, hanging out even when he mostly just slept through our conversations. But as weeks went by, he just got worse. His mum started talking about hospice care. Hospice. For a 24-year-old guy. That's when I knew we were running out of time. One night, while scrolling Reddit and Googling random crap like mystery illnesses, I came across a thread about Ouija boards. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Classic horror movie setup. But hear me out. The post wasn't about ghosts or demons or any of that Hollywood junk. It was about how some people claim to get answers to things science couldn't explain. People said it worked for them. And honestly, I was desperate enough to try anything. So I called up our friend group, Jess, Mike, and Hannah. They've been close to Nick for years, and they knew how bad things had gotten. At first, they laughed at the idea. Mike said, "What's next? You gonna light candles and chant in Latin?" But after some convincing and maybe a few beers, they agreed to come over. The night we planned this little séance was one of those chilly, rainy evenings where everything already feels off. Nick was too weak to join, so we set up the board in his living room while he slept in the next room. The guy was so out of it these days, we figured he wouldn't even notice. The Ouija board was Hannah's. She had it from a Halloween party years ago. It looked like every cheap board you've seen in stores, with the alphabet numbers yes, no, and goodbye printed on it. I thought it was kind of ridiculous at first, until we started. We dimmed the lights, lit some candles, Jess's idea to set the mood, and sat in a circle around the board. I placed my hands on the planchette first, feeling like an idiot. If there's anyone or anything out there that can help Nick, we're listening, I said, trying not to laugh. My voice sounded shaky though, and not in a funny way. Nothing happened for a long time. Just the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I was about to crack a joke when the planchette moved. It wasn't a huge move, just a twitch. But we all froze. "Who did that?" Mike whispered. "Not me," Jess said, pulling her hands back to prove her point. The planchette jerked again, harder this time. It slid to yes. Now, let me be clear. I was convinced someone was screwing around. Probably Mike because he's that guy. But when I looked at him, his face was pale and his hands were barely touching the planchette. Okay, who are we talking to? I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. The planchette started moving again, this time faster. It spelled out a name. IDA. Ida? Jess read aloud. Who the hell is Ida? No one answered. We waited, staring at the board like it was going to give us a clue. Then the planchette moved again. HELP. Help? Hannah repeated, her voice shaking. Are you trying to help us, or do you need help? The planchette slid to NICK. My stomach dropped. My hands were sweating, and I wanted to let go, but I couldn't. It felt like something was keeping me there. What do you mean? Can you help Nick? I asked. It moved to yes. What kind of help? Jess blurted out. What are we supposed to do? The planchette paused, then spelled out PAY. Pay? Pay what? Mike asked, his voice cracking. But instead of answering, the planchette started to slide faster, spelling out something long and complicated. It was hard to keep up, but eventually we pieced it together. A recipe. It wasn't normal though. It listed things I'd never heard of, like red valerian and nightshade extract, stuff that sounded more like ingredients for a potion than a cure. When it stopped moving, we all stared at the board in silence. This is insane, Mike finally said, standing up. We're seriously supposed to... What? Brew some medieval witch's brew to save Nick? Do we even have a choice? Jess shot back, her voice tight. He's dying, Mike. Hannah was already Googling the ingredients on her phone. Most of these are illegal, and even if they weren't, where would we even get them? I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to throw the board out the window and pretend this never happened. But another part, the desperate part, was already wondering how much of that list we could actually find. In the end, we wrote it down, just in case. We figured we'd sleep on it and decide what to do in the morning. But that night, as I lay awake on Nick's couch, I couldn't stop thinking about the way the planchette had felt under my fingers. Like it wasn't us moving it at all. And the worst part, I swore I could hear faint whispers coming from the board. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Jess and Hannah arguing in the kitchen. My head felt heavy, like I hadn't slept at all. But when I sat up, I realized I had bigger problems. The Ouija board was still on the floor where we left it, and the planchette. It had moved. It wasn't on goodbye where we left it. It was sitting on yes. I stared at it for a solid minute, trying to convince myself that someone must have bumped it during the night. Maybe Mike, on his way to the bathroom. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I hadn't heard a single sound all night, except those whispers. Jess poked her head out of the kitchen and gave me a look. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I pointed to the board. Did anyone touch that? She frowned and came over, followed by Hannah. Both of them looked at the board, then at me. Nick's been in bed all night, and Mike crashed on the recliner, Hannah said. You think the board just moved by itself? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The look on their faces told me they were thinking the same thing. Mike wandered in a few minutes later, groggy and still half asleep. What's with the serious faces? He muttered, grabbing a mug. Jess pointed to the board. It moved. He stopped mid-sip. You're kidding. Do we look like we're kidding? Jess snapped. For a while we all just stood there, staring at it like it was going to start moving again. I felt this weird pressure in the room, like the air was thicker than it should have been. Even the sound of the rain outside seemed muffled, like we were in some kind of bubble. Eventually, Mike broke the silence. All right, let's be real. We're not actually thinking about, doing what it said, right? No, of course not, I said automatically, but the words felt like a lie. Hannah was quiet, too quiet. She was still staring at her phone, scrolling through search results for the ingredients we wrote down. Finally, she spoke up. "So, I found a website." "Please don't say it's on the dark web," Mike groaned. "It's not," she said, but her tone wasn't exactly reassuring. "It's just sketchy, like really sketchy. They have most of the stuff on the list, but it's expensive, and there's no guarantee it's legit." I could feel the tension rising. Jess crossed her arms and started pacing. Mike kept shaking his head, muttering things like, "This is insane." But me, I couldn't stop thinking about Nick. I glanced at the hallway leading to his room. His door was cracked open, and I could see his mum sitting by his bed, holding his hand. He looked even worse than yesterday, his skin almost grey. "We have to try," I said finally. Mike stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you serious? Dude, this isn't a movie. We're not witch doctors. What if this stuff is poisonous? What if it kills him?" "He's already dying," I snapped. "What do we have to lose?" That shut him up, but it didn't make me feel any better. I knew this was crazy. I knew we were diving into something we didn't understand, but the thought of doing nothing, I couldn't live with that. By the afternoon, we had a plan. Hannah would order what we could online. And the rest? Well, that's where things got tricky. Some of the ingredients were illegal, like she said. We'd have to get creative. That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind to keep an eye on Nick. His mum looked exhausted, so I told her to get some rest while I took over. I wasn't expecting anything to happen, not really. But around 2 a.m, I heard it again. The whispers. They were faint, just on the edge of hearing, but they were definitely there. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent chills down my spine. It wasn't like a voice. It was more like multiple voices layered on top of each other, speaking in some language I didn't recognize. I sat frozen in the chair, staring at the doorway. The whispers were coming from the living room, from the board. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay put, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something drew me to it, like I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping toward the sound. When I reached the board, I saw the planchette moving. I swear to you, no one was touching it. I was alone, but it was sliding across the board like it had a mind of its own. WHYAREYOUWAITING. I felt like I was going to throw up. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The planchette paused, then moved again. PAY. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed the board and shoved it into a closet, slamming the door shut. The whispers stopped immediately, but the silence that followed was almost worse. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me. When morning came, I told myself it was just my imagination. Stress, lack of sleep, whatever. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The board wanted us to finish what we started, and somehow I knew it wouldn't let us stop. The day after the board moved by itself, something shifted in the house. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like the place was alive. Every creak of the floorboards sounded deliberate. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too long. Even Nick's dog, Buddy, who's usually glued to his side, refused to go near the living room. He just sat by the front door, whining softly. I tried to ignore it. I mean, what else could I do? The package from Hannah's sketchy website was supposed to arrive that evening, and we were scrambling to figure out the rest of the ingredients. Jess and Mike had gone out to try and track down the more exotic stuff, nightshade extract, for example. Apparently, you could get it if you knew the right people. Don't ask me how Mike knew that. By the time everyone showed up, the house felt like it was suffocating. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and the temperature had dropped so much that you could see your breath. No one said anything about it, but we all noticed. You could see it in the way Jess kept glancing over her shoulder, and how Mike wouldn't let go of his hoodie's drawstrings. Hannah set the package down on the coffee table. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied up with string, and reeked of something earthy and sharp. When she cut it open, we all leaned in like it was some kind of cursed treasure chest. Inside were small vials, bundles of dried herbs, and a jar of something black and sticky that looked like tar. "This is all of it?" I asked, already regretting everything. "Most of it," Hannah said. "We're still missing a few things, but this..." She held up the tar jar. "This is the base. It's called black resin. Apparently it's what makes the whole thing work." "Work how?" Jess asked, her voice sharper than usual. She was sitting as far away from the table as possible, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Hannah shrugged. "I don't know. The site just said it's essential for binding the cure. Whatever that means." Mike snorted. "Binding? Are we curing Nick or summoning Satan?" "Can you not?" I snapped. "We're doing this for him, okay? If you're too scared..." "I'm not scared," he interrupted, but he didn't sound convincing. "I just think this is insane. You saw what the board did, right? It's not normal." None of this was normal. But we didn't have time to argue. Nick was getting worse by the hour. His breathing had become shallow, and he hadn't opened his eyes all day. If we didn't act now, we'd lose him. We set everything up in the kitchen, far away from the board. The instructions from the Ouija session were burned into my brain, but I still read over the notes we'd written down to make sure we got it right. Mix the resin with the herbs, add water, heat it until it thickens, and then... well, then came the hard part. "It says we need blood," Jess said, reading over my shoulder. Her voice was flat, but I could tell she was freaking out. "Just a drop. From all of us." "Why?" Mike asked, already backing away. "Why does it need blood?" Hannah shrugged again. "I mean, it's probably symbolic, you know, like a pact or something." "A pact with what?" Mike shot back. "Does it matter?" I cut in. "We've come this far. Are we really going to stop now?" Jess sighed and grabbed a paring knife from the drawer. "Fine, let's just get it over with." We each pricked our fingers, letting a drop of blood fall into the bubbling mixture. It hissed on contact, turning the dark liquid into a deep, swirling red. The smell was unbearable, like burning metal and rotten fruit, but we pressed on. When it was done, the cure looked more like sludge than medicine. We poured it into a small glass jar and carried it to Nick's room. His mum was sitting by his bed, her face drawn and pale. She didn't ask what we were holding. She just nodded and left the room, closing the door behind her. "Are we sure about this?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. "No," I admitted. "But we don't have a choice." We tilted Nick's head back and poured the mixture down his throat. He didn't even flinch. For a moment, nothing happened. He just lay there, motionless, his breathing so faint it was barely there. And then he started screaming. It wasn't a normal scream. It was guttural, animalistic, like it was being torn from the deepest part of him. His back arched off the bed and his hands clawed at the air. His eyes flew open, but they weren't his eyes. They were pitch black, like two empty voids staring right through us. We all jumped back, horrified. Jess was crying. Mike was frozen, his mouth hanging open. Even Hannah looked like she was about to bolt. "Nick!" I shouted, grabbing his shoulders. "Nick, can you hear me?" He stopped screaming as suddenly as he'd started. His body went limp and his eyes fluttered closed. For a few heart-stopping seconds, I thought he was gone. But then he took a deep, shuddering breath. When he opened his eyes again, they were normal. He blinked a few times, looking around the room like he was waking up from a long nap. "What? What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse but steady. Relief flooded through me. "You're okay," I said, my voice breaking. "You're okay." But as I helped him sit up, I noticed something strange. On the back of his hand, just above his wrist, was a small, black mark. It looked like a tattoo, but it wasn't there before. It was a circle with some kind of weird symbol inside. A triangle with an eye in the center. "What the hell is that?" Jess whispered, pointing at the mark. Nick frowned and looked at it. I don't know. It doesn't hurt." We all exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said what we were thinking. We didn't need to. The cure had worked, but it had come with a price. And deep down, I knew we hadn't paid it in full. Nick seemed better at first. Better than better, actually. By the next day, he was walking around, cracking jokes, and eating everything in sight like he hadn't been bedridden for weeks. His colour was back. His energy was through the roof. It was like nothing had ever been wrong with him. But then there was the mark. That black symbol on his wrist. It didn't fade. It didn't wash off. It was just there. And the longer we looked at it, the more it seemed to shift. I know how crazy that sounds, but it's true. If you stared at it too long, you'd swear the eye in the middle blinked. Jess tried to brush it off. Maybe it's like a reaction to the cure or something. Some weird chemical stain. Mike wasn't convinced. "Yeah, because chemical stains usually blink at you," he muttered, keeping his distance from Nick. Nick himself didn't seem too concerned. "It's probably nothing," he said, shrugging it off. "I mean, come on guys, I'm alive, aren't I? That's what matters." And for a little while, we let ourselves believe that. We wanted to believe it. We wanted to believe that we'd done the impossible, that we'd saved him, and that the mark was just some weird side effect that didn't mean anything. But then things started happening. The first thing was small. That night, Nick's dog, Buddy, wouldn't go near him. Usually, Buddy was glued to Nick's side, but now he growled whenever Nick came close. And it wasn't just Buddy. Birds stopped landing on the feeders outside his window. Squirrels that used to dart across the lawn avoided the house entirely. Then there was the temperature. Nick kept complaining that he was cold, even though the house was warm enough to make the rest of us sweat. He started wearing hoodies and blankets all the time, but no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the chill. And then there were the voices. It started with Nick hearing them. "It's probably just in my head," he told me one night when we were hanging out in his room. He said it like he was trying to convince himself more than me. You know, like leftover trauma or whatever. I mean, I was dying, right? Makes sense my brain's a little scrambled. But the way he described them didn't sound like trauma. He said they were whispers, soft and faint, but constant. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone made his skin crawl. He said it felt like they were watching him. And then, a few nights later, we all started hearing them too. It was around midnight, and we were in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie. Nick had fallen asleep on the couch, his hoodie pulled up over his face. The rest of us were too wired to sleep. Hannah was scrolling on her phone, Jess was pretending to watch the movie, and Mike was nursing his third beer of the night. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, faint and distant, like it was coming from the walls. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Hannah looked up from her phone, her eyes wide. "Yeah," she said. "I thought I was imagining it." The whispers grew louder, but no clearer. It was like a dozen voices overlapping, speaking in a language none of us understood. The sound seemed to seep into the room, filling every corner, wrapping around us like invisible tendrils. "Okay, that's it," Mike said, standing up. "I'm out. I don't care what we agreed to. This is messed up." He barely made it to the door before the power went out. The lights, the TV, even Hannah's phone, all of it shut off at once, plunging the room into total darkness. "What the hell?" Jess shouted, her voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, Nick sat bolt upright on the couch. His head snapped toward us, and even in the dim light from the candles we'd left burning on the table, I could see his eyes. They were black again, just like the night we gave him the cure. "Nick," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at us with those empty, void-like eyes. And then he smiled. It wasn't his smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like his face didn't quite know how to form the expression. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else, and Nick started laughing. "Nick, stop it!" Jess shouted, grabbing his arm. "You're scaring us!" But the moment she touched him, she screamed and jerked back, clutching her hand. Her palm was bright red, like she'd just touched a hot stove. The lights flickered back on, and Nick's eyes returned to normal. He blinked a few times, looking around like he didn't know where he was. What just happened?" he asked, his voice shaky. None of us answered. We were too busy staring at Jess's hand, which was blistering right before our eyes. "Nick," I said slowly, I think something came back with you." He looked down at his hands, his face pale. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, it's just me. I'm fine." But as he said it, the mark on his wrist started to glow. It wasn't bright, but in the dim light of the room, it was unmistakable. The black lines shimmered like they were alive, pulsing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. "We need to get rid of it," Hannah said, her voice firm. "The mark, the board, all of it. We need to undo whatever we did." Nick looked at her, panic flashing in his eyes. "No," he said. "You can't. It saved me. I don't care what's happening. It worked. I'm not going back to the way I was." I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew he was right. We'd saved him, but we hadn't just cured his body. We'd brought something else into this world, and whatever it wasn't done with us yet. The days after the glowing mark incident were a nightmare. Nick wasn't just hearing whispers anymore, he was answering them. We'd catch him muttering under his breath, staring at walls, holding conversations with empty corners of the room. At first he denied it, saying we were imagining things. But then one night, we saw him. Mike had stayed over to keep watch while the rest of us tried to figure out our next move. Around 3 a.m, he woke me up, shaking my shoulder. "You need to see this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I followed him to the living room, my heart pounding. Nick was standing in the center of the room, his back to us, lit only by the faint glow of the mark on his wrist. He was holding the Ouija board, speaking in a low, guttural voice that didn't sound like him at all. The planchette was moving under his hand, faster than it should have been, spelling out something we couldn't read from where we stood. "Nick!" I called out, my voice shaking. He froze, his head tilting slightly like he'd just heard something far away. Then he turned around, and I swear my blood went cold. His eyes weren't just black this time. They were empty, like two bottomless pits staring back at us. The mark on his wrist pulsed brighter, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "You shouldn't have interrupted," he said, his voice layered with something else, something that wasn't human. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Nick smiled. That same unnatural, too wide grin we'd seen before. "The ones who gave me back my life. They're not happy." "Not happy about what?" Mike asked, taking a cautious step forward. "They say we haven't paid enough," Nick said. His head tilted further, almost unnaturally, as if he was listening to something only he could hear. "The debt is overdue." "What do they want?" I demanded, my panic rising. Nick's smile disappeared. He looked down at the board, then back at us. "They want me." For a second, I didn't understand. Then it hit me like a punch to the gut. The cure wasn't free. It had always come with a price. And now, they were here to collect. "No," I said, shaking my head. "We can fix this. We can—" "It's too late," Nick interrupted. His voice cracked, and for the first time in weeks, he looked like himself again. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands trembling as he held the board. "They're coming." The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the whispers came back, louder than ever. They seemed to swirl around us, filling the air with a chaotic cacophony of voices. The candles we'd lit flickered violently, their flames stretching and twisting like they were alive. The board in Nick's hands began to shake, the planchette moving on its own. It spelled out one word, over and over. Debt. Nick clutched his head, falling to his knees. "I didn't ask for this," he screamed. "I didn't know what I was agreeing to." I rushed to his side, grabbing his shoulders. "We'll stop it," I said, my voice desperate. "We'll get rid of the board, the mark, everything. We'll make it right." Nick looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It's not just me. They want all of us." As soon as the words left his mouth, the lights in the house exploded, plunging us into total darkness. The whispers grew deafening, and the air around us felt like it was vibrating. I could barely see, but I felt something moving in the room with us. Not Nick, not Mike or Jess or Hannah. Something else. "Get the board!" Jess screamed, her voice barely audible over the chaos. I stumbled toward the table, grabbing the Ouija board. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. The planchette was still moving, carving deep scratches into the surface of the board as it spelled out that same word, debt. "What do we do?" Hannah shouted. "Burn it!" Mike yelled. "We have to destroy it!" Without thinking, I ran to the fireplace and threw the board in. It landed with a dull thud, the flames licking at its edges. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the board began to crack, splitting down the middle as the fire consumed it. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a screeching, otherworldly wail that made my ears feel like they were going to burst. And then, silence. The room was still. The air was warm again. The candles had gone out, but the faint light of the dying fire cast long shadows on the walls. We looked at each other, too stunned to speak. Nick was lying on the floor, unconscious. The mark on his wrist was gone, leaving only a faint scar. We waited, holding our breath until he stirred. When he opened his eyes, they were normal again. "Is it over?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. Nick sat up slowly, his face pale but calm. I think so," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We wanted to believe him. We needed to believe him. But deep down, I think we all knew the truth. The board was gone. The mark was gone. But the debt? That was something you couldn't just burn away. Nick recovered, but things were never the same after that night. We drifted apart, each of us carrying the weight of what we'd done. I haven't seen him in months, but every now and then I get a text from an unknown number. No words, just a picture of a black mark. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. The Ouija board told me my sister has a secret. Now I'm finding messages left in my room at night. All right. So, I don't even know where to start with this, because it still feels so unreal. Like, you hear these stories online and think, yeah, sure, okay. But living it? It's a whole different beast. This all started because of a stupid Ouija board and my sister, Ellie. She's 19, just a year older than me, and she's always been into the weird spiritual stuff. Tarot cards, crystals, astrology, you name it. I used to roll my eyes whenever she'd talk about it. But now I'm wondering if I should have taken her more seriously. It was last Friday night. Ellie had invited her best friend, Hannah, over, and the two of them were doing their usual thing, burning incense, playing with their pendulums, and laughing like they were summoning a ghost to join in on the fun. I was minding my own business in my room when Ellie barged in, holding a Ouija board like it was a prize. "Come on, Jamie," she said, grinning like a kid who just found out recess was extended. "Hannah and I are going to try this, but we need 3 people. You're in." I said no. Of course, I said no. I've watched enough movies to know these things never end well, but Ellie is persistent. She threw on the puppy dog eyes and started guilt-tripping me about how I never spend time with her anymore. I caved, because, well, she's my sister. We set the board up in the living room, dimmed the lights, and lit a few candles for ambience. I was already regretting this. Hannah kept laughing nervously and looking over her shoulder like she expected a demon to materialize behind her. "Okay, let's just get this over with," I said, placing my fingers on the planchette. Ellie went through her whole dramatic spiel, asking for spirits, welcoming them into our space, all that jazz. I didn't believe any of it, but I played along because I wanted it to be over. At first, nothing happened. The planchette sat there, completely still. I was about to call it quits when Ellie asked a question that made me freeze. "What's my brother hiding from me?" she said, her tone teasing. I shot her a look. "What? Are you serious?" She shrugged. "It's just a game. Relax." I didn't move the planchette, but it started to slide. At first, I thought it was one of them messing with me, but then it spelled out something that made my stomach drop. "He's not the one hiding." We all stared at the board, silent. The air felt heavy, like someone had cranked up the pressure in the room. Ellie cleared her throat. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice quieter now. The planchette moved again, faster this time. "Ask about her." Ellie looked at me, confused. "What the hell? Is this you?" I swore up and down it wasn't me, and I was dead serious. The look on my face must have convinced her because she just sat there, staring at the board like it might explode. "Fine," she said after a moment. "What am I hiding?" The planchette didn't spell out words this time. Instead, it moved in small, slow circles, over and over. Hannah whispered something about that being a bad sign, but Ellie was too focused to hear her. I tried to pull my hands back, but Ellie snapped, "Don't let go!" So I stayed put. The planchette finally stopped and pointed directly at Ellie. Then it slid to the word goodbye. She laughed, but it sounded forced. "See, it's just a stupid game." I didn't say anything. The atmosphere in the room was weird. Not scary exactly, but tense, like the board had just called Ellie out on something real, and she wasn't ready to admit it. After that, we packed up the board, and Ellie and Hannah went back to their room. I thought that was the end of it. I wanted it to be the end of it, but it wasn't. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just rain hitting my window, but when I sat up, I realized it was coming from inside my room. My desk chair was spinning slowly, like someone had just pushed it. I swear, I felt my heart skip a beat. "Ellie!" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I got up and turned on the light, but nothing was there, just my empty room. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that maybe I'd left the chair in a weird position or something. But when I went to sit back on my bed, I saw it. A piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting on my pillow. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and unfolded it. The note was written in sloppy, jagged handwriting I didn't recognize. "Ask her about the basement." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my cereal like it might have the answers. Ellie strolled in, acting like nothing was weird about last night. She grabbed a mug and started making coffee, humming some pop song that had been stuck in her head all week. I couldn't stop thinking about the note. "Ellie," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "does anything weird ever happen to you? Like, at night?" She glanced at me over her shoulder, raising an eyebrow. "Weird how?" I hesitated. "I don't know, like noises or stuff moving." She snorted. "You're so paranoid. You probably psyched yourself out with the Ouija board. Nothing weird happens to me." She paused, then added with a smirk, "Maybe the spirits like you better." I wanted to laugh, but her comment hit differently. It didn't feel like a joke. I didn't tell her about the note. Honestly, I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding insane. And then there was the basement. The basement was nothing special, just a cold, unfinished space where we stored Christmas decorations and junk we never used anymore. I couldn't think of a single reason why it would come up in that note. But by lunchtime, the curiosity was eating me alive. I waited until Ellie left the house to run errands before grabbing a flashlight and heading downstairs. The air grew colder with every step. Our basement always had this damp, musty smell, but today it was worse, like mildew and something faintly metallic. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, scanning the room with my flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place. Boxes stacked in the corner, a few old shelves covered in cobwebs, and the washing machine that hadn't worked in years. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. Then I noticed the scratches. They were faint, barely visible against the concrete wall by the far corner, thin, jagged lines like someone had dragged a nail across the surface. I crouched down to get a closer look and realized they weren't random. They formed letters, words. "Don't trust her!" I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting weird, jittery shadows on the walls. My breathing felt too loud, echoing in the silent basement. My first thought was Ellie. She must have done this. She probably wrote that note too. It had to be her. But why? Before I could dwell on it, I heard something upstairs. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the kitchen floor. My blood turned to ice. Ellie wasn't supposed to be home yet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. I crept up the stairs, every creak of the wooden steps making my heart race. The kitchen was empty, the back door was locked, but the front door was wide open, letting in a gust of cold November air. I slammed it shut and locked it, my hands trembling. The house felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. I went to check the other rooms, half expecting to find someone hiding, but everything looked normal. My nerves were shot, and I decided to text Ellie. "Me. Did you come home and leave again?" She replied almost instantly. Ellie. "No, still out. Why?" I didn't answer. What could I say? That someone, or something, was walking around our house. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my room. I crashed on the couch in the living room, wrapping myself in a blanket like it might shield me from whatever was happening. I left the TV on for background noise, flipping through channels until I landed on some mindless sitcom. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to a different noise, a faint tapping, coming from somewhere nearby. My heart sank. Not again. I sat up, scanning the room. At first I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. Then I saw it. The mirror. We had this big old mirror hanging on the wall across from the couch. The tapping was coming from there, like someone was on the other side, trying to get my attention. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were glued to it. For a second, I thought I saw something move, just a shadow, faint and quick, like it darted past the edges of the glass. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Then the TV shut off. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. My chest tightened as I fumbled for the remote, hitting buttons like a maniac, but the screen stayed black. That's when I noticed the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't me. It was a figure standing in the middle of the room, just barely visible in the dim light. Tall, with long, messy hair and a hunched posture. It was staring at me, though I couldn't see its face. My hands went numb, the remote slipping from my fingers. The figure raised a hand and pointed toward me, then slowly toward the hallway that led to my room. I bolted. I didn't care where I went as long as it wasn't there. I ran out the front door, barefoot and shaking, and didn't stop until I was halfway down the block. I stood there under the streetlights, gasping for air, my mind racing. When I finally worked up the nerve to go back, the house was silent again. The mirror was just a mirror, reflecting the empty couch and the flickering candles on the coffee table. But when I walked into my room, I found another note. This one wasn't folded. It was taped to my wall, right above my bed. The handwriting was the same jagged scrawl as before. "It knows you're looking." I didn't sleep that night either. The next day, I felt like a zombie. I could barely keep my eyes open, but every time I thought about sleeping, I'd remember the figure in the mirror or the words scrawled above my bed. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was exhaustion mixed with paranoia. Ellie noticed something was off. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and watching me like I was a science experiment. "You look like death," she said, finally breaking the silence. "Thanks," I muttered, staring into my cereal. She leaned forward, resting her chin in her hand. "All right, spill. What's going on? You're acting weird." For a split second, I wanted to tell her everything. The notes, the mirror, the basement. But I couldn't. Not yet. Something about the message on the wall downstairs stuck with me. Don't trust her. What if this was connected to Ellie somehow? What if the Ouija board wasn't just a game? Instead, I said, "Just bad dreams. Probably from that stupid Ouija board." Ellie rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, Jamie, you're such a baby. It's just a piece of cardboard." I didn't argue. What was the point? The rest of the day dragged on. Ellie left to hang out with Hannah again, and I stayed home, trying to distract myself with video games. But I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. By the time night rolled around, I was too tired to be scared. I figured if I stayed up much longer, I'd lose my mind, so I decided to sleep in Ellie's room. She wasn't home yet, and being in her space felt safer than staying in mine. Her room smelled like vanilla candles, and faintly of incense. I curled up on her bed, pulling the blankets over my head like a kid hiding from monsters, and for the first time in 2 days, I actually fell asleep. That didn't last long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was quiet at first, almost like whispering. I thought maybe Ellie had come home and was talking on the phone or something. But when I sat up and looked around, the room was empty. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from the hallway or outside. It was coming from under the bed. My heart stopped. I froze, staring at the edge of the mattress, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whispers kept going, overlapping and garbled, like dozens of voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, pinned in place by this invisible weight. Then the bed shifted. Not a little creak, but a full jolt, like someone underneath had pushed up against it. I bit back a scream, tears streaming down my face as the whispers turned into a low growl. Finally, I snapped out of it. I leapt off the bed and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate and heavy, coming from Ellie's room, but they didn't sound like hers. The door creaked open. I bolted down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. I didn't stop until I reached the living room, where I grabbed my phone and called Ellie. She picked up on the third ring. "What?" she said, sounding annoyed. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Still at Hannah's. Why?" I didn't know what to say. If she wasn't home, then who or what had opened that door? Instead of answering, I hung up and ran out of the house. I ended up sitting on the curb for what felt like hours, clutching my phone and waiting for Ellie to come home. When she finally pulled into the driveway, I ran up to her, babbling incoherently about the noises, the whispers, and the bed. She didn't believe me, of course. "You're losing it," she said, rolling her eyes. "You probably had sleep paralysis or something. Just chill." But when we went back inside, I saw it. Another note sitting on the coffee table. Ellie noticed it too. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the words aloud. "It hides where she sleeps." Her face went pale. "Okay," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't match the look in her eyes. "This isn't funny. Did you do this?" I shook my head, feeling a cold sweat drip down my neck. Ellie crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. This is stupid. I'm going to bed. Ellie, I started, but she cut me off. Don't! I'm tired, Jamie. Just drop it. She stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, staring at the trash can, knowing I wouldn't sleep a second that night, because the note wasn't in my handwriting. It wasn't in hers either, and the message was clear. Whatever this thing was, it was coming for her next. I didn't sleep. I stayed on the couch, my eyes fixed on the hallway that led to Ellie's room. Every noise made me jump, the groan of the house settling, the faint hum of the fridge. By now, I wasn't sure what scared me more. The idea that something was in the house, or the possibility that whatever it was had already gotten to Ellie. Around 3 a.m, the silence was broken by a loud bang. It sounded like something heavy had slammed against the basement door. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat frozen, gripping the edge of the couch. Another bang. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard it, but the noise was impossible to ignore. The third bang was louder, more urgent, and it shook the floor beneath me. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a fire poker from the stand by the fireplace, and crept toward the basement door. My palms were slick with sweat, and every step felt like it took an eternity. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The handle was cold to the touch, and for a second I thought about turning around and locking myself in my room until morning. But something told me I couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. I opened the door. The basement was pitch black. I stood at the top of the stairs staring into the darkness, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The air smelled worse than before, like rot, damp earth, and something metallic. "Ellie!" I called out, even though I knew she couldn't be down there. No response. The banging had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was so heavy, so suffocating, that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I took a step down, then another. The stairs creaked under my weight, each one louder than the last. Halfway down, my flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought it would go out completely. That's when I saw it. The far corner of the basement, where the scratches had been, was no longer empty. Something was crouched there just outside the beam of light. I could only make out its outline, a hunched, human-like figure with limbs that seemed too long, and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to notice me at first. I should have gone back upstairs. I should have slammed the door, locked it, and called the police. But instead, I took another step closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who are you?" I whispered. The thing shifted. Slowly, it turned its head toward me, and I caught a glimpse of its face. Pale, stretched skin, hollow eye sockets, and a mouth that was too wide, filled with teeth that looked sharp enough to shred bone. It smiled. I stumbled back, tripping over the last step and falling onto the cold basement floor. The flashlight slipped from my hand, rolling away as the beam landed on something else, another message, scratched into the concrete wall. "She lied to you." My breath hitched as the figure stood up, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't run toward me, didn't attack. It just pointed, at the ceiling, at Ellie's room. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and bolting up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, pressing my weight against it, as if that would somehow keep the thing from getting out. My heart was racing as I sprinted down the hallway to Ellie's room. I banged on the door, yelling her name. "Ellie, open the door!" No response. I twisted the knob, but it was locked. Panic set in as I threw my shoulder against the door, slamming into it with all my weight. It took 3 tries before it finally gave way. Ellie's room was empty. The bed was unmade. Her clothes were scattered across the floor, and her window was wide open. Cold air rushed in, making the curtains flutter like they were waving goodbye. "Ellie!" I shouted, leaning out the window. The backyard was empty, the grass glistening with dew under the pale glow of the moon. That's when I saw it. Another note, taped to the inside of the window frame. This one was shorter, messier, like it had been written in a hurry. "It's too late." I crumpled the note in my hand, tears stinging my eyes. My sister was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out into the night, hoping I'd see her running back toward the house. But the backyard stayed empty, the shadows too thick to see past the tree line. Eventually, I sat down on the edge of her bed, my head in my hands. I felt helpless, like I'd already lost. That's when I heard her voice. "Jamie." It was faint, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. "Jamie, help me." I looked up, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the basement. Her voice sent chills down my spine. It was Ellie, no doubt about it, but there was something off, like it was distorted, hollow, echoing in a way that voices shouldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away from the basement, but what choice did I have? If there was even the slightest chance she was down there, I had to go. I grabbed the fire poker again, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. My legs felt like lead as I approached the basement door. The cold air from the gap at the bottom brushed against my ankles, and the smell hit me again, stronger, fouler. It was almost suffocating. "Jamie, hurry." Her voice called again, softer this time, like she was running out of strength. I unlocked the door and opened it slowly. The stairs stretched down into darkness, but there was a faint glow at the bottom. Orange, flickering, like candlelight. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair. Then another. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The basement was completely transformed. The cluttered shelves and old boxes were gone, replaced by a circle of candles arranged around a symbol drawn on the floor in what looked like dried blood. In the centre of the circle stood Ellie. Her back was to me, her head hanging low, her long hair covering her face. "Ellie!" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't move. I stepped closer, gripping the fire poker tighter. "Ellie, we need to get out of here." Her head twitched, tilting slightly to the side. "You shouldn't have come down here," she said, her voice low and raspy, nothing like the Ellie I knew. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my throat dry. "We need to go, now." She laughed. It was a hollow, chilling sound that echoed off the walls. "You don't understand, Jamie. It's already done." "What's done?" I demanded, my voice trembling. She turned slowly, and the sight of her face made my stomach drop. Her eyes were pitch black, and her skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins spidering out across her cheeks. But the worst part was her smile, too wide, too sharp, stretching unnaturally across her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her tone almost playful. "I just wanted to know the truth. The board showed me, but it wanted more." I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ellie, what are you talking about? What did you do?" She took a step toward me, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete. "It wanted to play a game. It wanted someone else." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "This isn't you. Whatever this is, it's not you." She tilted her head again, the smile fading. "You're right," she said softly. "I'm not your sister anymore." Before I could react, the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. I swung the flashlight wildly, trying to find her, but she was gone. The air was freezing now, every breath visible in the dim beam of light. Then I heard it, a low growl, followed by the sound of something crawling. Fast. I turned, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and caught a glimpse of her, or whatever she'd become, skittering along the wall like a spider. Her movements were jerky, inhuman, and her black eyes gleamed in the dim light. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, just sprinted up the stairs and slammed the basement door behind me. My chest was heaving, my mind racing. But as I turned the lock, I heard her voice again, right on the other side. "You can't leave, Jamie! It's not over!" I stumbled back, gripping the fire poker like it could actually protect me. The door rattled, but it didn't open. I kept backing up, my eyes locked on the door, until I bumped into something behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head. Ellie, or what used to be Ellie, was standing in the hallway, her head tilted at that unnatural angle, her black eyes fixed on me. "Why are you running?" she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I swung the fire poker, but she was faster. She darted to the side, her movements a blur, and the poker hit nothing but air. Before I could swing again, she lunged at me, her sharp grin inches from my face. Everything went black. I woke up in my room, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. For a second, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I sat up, I saw the scratches on the wall, the same jagged letters as before. "Don't look for her." Ellie's room was empty. Her bed, her clothes, everything. It was like she'd never lived there. My parents, who had been out of town for the past week, acted like they didn't even remember her. I don't know what happened that night, or where Ellie went. But every night since, I've woken up to faint whispers coming from the basement. And sometimes, when I pass by a mirror, I catch a glimpse of her standing behind me, smiling,